Hello and welcome to Arsenal Analysed. I'm JC. I hope you're doing well. Today I bring you yet another very special episode of Arsenal transfer news as I'm joined by an even special guest, Ben Jacobs from CBS Sports. How are we doing today, my friend?
Yeah, good to be here. I've enjoyed some London heat over the last few days, and then we're also based in America as well, where it's very hot too. And pre-season is ramping up, transfer window too, so it's busy times.
Busy times indeed. And I imagine that you're a very busy man this time of season as well. So I am very grateful for you spending some time with me today. And I'm sure a lot of Gooners who do eventually tune in to watch this video are keen to see what you have to say about transfers. But there were a few questions that I was keen to ask you prior to that. I know you're a Leicester City fan, and I know you have a love for football. And I was curious myself to just kind of understand sort of where that love for football and Leicester came from, where it all sort of started for you, I suppose.
Yeah, it's a great question. Born and bred in Leicester, and a firm believer that you support your local team, and the fact that we went on to win the Premier League, an added bonus. But really, my love for Leicester started in the 90s, and my family have been season ticket holders at Leicester for many, many years at Filbert Street and then the King Power Stadium. So I used to go down with my dad. I was mascot once for a reserve game against Notts County, and the Notts County captain was Mark Draper at that point, playing for their B team, who obviously then went on to be a relatively known footballer. And I remember walking out onto the field, probably only about age 4 or 5, and kicking the ball into the back of the net past a goalkeeper called Carl Muggleton. And at the time, I thought I'd scored a worldie. And family were in the sort of stand applauding me afterwards. And then I watched back a video, and it was clear, unfortunately, retrospectively, that this goalkeeper Muggleton had clearly just let the ball go through his leg. At the time, I thought I was on a path to become a world-class footballer. Really, my first memory, and it's a little bit perverse in some ways, was actually a Leicester defeat. And it was against Newcastle United in 1992. It was a big game for Newcastle because they were in real danger of going down into Division 3 for the first ever time. And Leicester trailed in the game. And then late on in the 89th minute, Steve Walsh, one of our most iconic players in defence, who always tended to crop up and score important goals as well, equalised, and the Leicester crowd went nuts at Filbert Street. And then minutes later, in added time, Walsh then scored an own goal, and Newcastle United won the game. And there was a pitch invasion, and I'm not sure whether many Arsenal fans will remember the kind of old Filbert Street, but possibly because it housed that iconic Dennis Bergkamp hat-trick, of course, with that one twist finish into the bottom corner in particular that everyone remembers as one of the great Premier League goals, and I think hat-tricks generally. But anyway, on the far side, there was a sort of shed end, and usually the away supporters just got a small portion of that, but Newcastle were given the entire stand. And I remember being so wowed by how vocal they were. And to be honest with you, even though it's a kind of bad thing to say because pitch invasions aren't cool, but I remember thinking really, really young, how amazing it was to see such a high volume of passionate football supporters, and even some fans were on the field as well, running onto the pitch. And I think as a young kid, you still kind of think, oh, if I get to go on the pitch, if I get to touch the grass, that'll be amazing. Not that I ever encouraged pitch invasion, but at the time that just made me think, wow, football's cool, what a community. And ever since, I wanted to be a part of that football culture, and always also had a soft spot for Newcastle United as well. So that was probably a football memory.
There's some great memories in there, both of which that you've mentioned, definitely up there, especially the one as a mascot. But I suppose you're lucky enough to kind of build upon that love for football now and sort of build a career in journalism, more specifically, you know, around football. And I was curious to kind of know sort of how that happened and sort of how you've managed to get to where you are today.
Yeah, I always wanted to be a football commentator, and I started at my local radio station at the BBC in Leicester, really just making tea and answering phone calls. They used to run a weekly competition on match days around predict the score and the first scorer. And the lights on the phone used to be really crazy, and they needed extra help, therefore, answering them all because they'd get 200 or 300 all calling in at the same time. So I'd come in and I would answer phone calls and I would make tea. And then finally, I got an opportunity to go out a few years later to local games around first Leicestershire and then Oxfordshire, because when I went to university in Oxford, where I studied English, BBC Oxford and BBC Reading, or Berkshire as it's actually known, they were both in the same place, both out of Oxford. So you had Reading and you had Oxford. And the sort of irony was that Oxford were the bigger team and the more followed team, but over time, Reading made their way to the Premier League and Oxford moved in the other direction. And I got in with Reading relatively early, so I got the opportunity to go to a few games, and then I actually ended up joining a commercial station owned by John Medeski as the commentator for Reading when they were in the Premier League, doing week in, week out commentary. And I've continued that commentary ever since. And then I moved through the BBC and eventually out into the Middle East for beIN Sports. And when Qatar won the World Cup for 2022, which is obviously this winter, beIN Sports kind of relocated everybody to Doha. So I was able to spend some time there as a senior reporter.
Awesome.
And then after that, moved to America, did a lot of consultancy. So I think one of the questions people always ask me is, why are you suddenly reporting on this transfer window and not the last one or the one before that? The answer to that question is because the 4 years prior to coming back into journalism with CBS, in that gap between beIN and now, I was working for top level football clubs as content consultant, strategic consultant, digital consultant, commercial consultant. I was working with FIFA and other organizations on projects like the Women's World Cup, on Qatar 2022. And naturally, you have to be very careful because during that time, you're embedded within a club, you're with executives working on projects where you have to respect the fact that you can't use your journalism to give away what you know. And you'll see even during the transfer window still, if I've been in a club recently, I went into one top club only a month ago to do some media training with all of their executives. And I won't touch that football club because you have to respect that what they've told you isn't with your journalism cap on. And that's the balance ultimately. But anyway, now I'm back at CBS, and as a senior reporter and storyteller across the broadcast.com and digital channels, I'm able to revisit the window now and to some extent break the stories that I know as a journalist. So I was across the takeover, but what you can't do is obviously dig out a bit of information that you knew as a consultant and then publish it, because that's a breach of your sort of NDA and it would be very unfair on the source. And the thing I think fans don't appreciate, which is just an interesting aside to try and give you insight about the transfer window, is that most journalists will know 80-90% of information that they choose not to publish, because it's all about your protection and your relationship with the source. So when I'm, for example, speaking to directors of football, 99 times out of 100, I'm not discussing a transfer with them, because you will go to them on rare occasions, to give you something like a confirmation or an exclusive based upon that relationship. But if every day and time you're just going to them when they're busy, when they're working in a window, and the only thing you're ever asking is to be first on a story, then you're going to get something out of them. So it's all about relationship building. And sometimes you build that relationship because you get given something and you don't run with it, or you hold it, or you wait for it, or you don't run it because another source has conflicted that. And then you realize that perhaps there is a competing narrative. So it's kind of waiting and building relationships to the point where finally you feel that you've got source buy-in, either on or off record, but also you've obviously got multiple sources in place to make sure that what you're saying has some kind of validity to it, and you're not going to be contacted by the buyer versus the seller, or the player versus the agent. So it's quite a fine balance. I don't love the transfer window, if I'm absolutely honest. I much prefer impactful stories where sport meets business, sport meets social activism, in-depth interviews where you can really dig in. But first and foremost, as a broadcaster, the advantage that I have is that everything I do at large, even though I do some writing, and you will see me on Twitter, but everything at large is in a live environment. So you're giving it as it is at the time of broadcast, and then you're done with your broadcast. So you're not fixed to some kind of .com daily article, a date within 10 minutes. At the time of broadcast, you're confident that you're sort of accurate in your information. And that's what I love, the fact that you can just engage with the fan base. You can go live on a television channel and you're confident that at that time, because you'll have spoken to a source minutes or hours before, you know that you're right in your information. And if it changes, come back on the broadcast again. What I think the print part of the transfer window struggles with is, unless you constantly want to update your article as a blog, then within an hour or a day, even if the crux of the article is right, something could have changed. And that's quite frustrating because it's just there for all to read.
Well, to be honest with you, you've given some absolutely fantastic insight there, because a lot of what you've just mentioned, we only see, the articles, the reports, or what you post on Twitter, for example. We have, as fans, no idea what you guys go through, behind the scenes. And like you said, the risks that you run in reporting this, that, or the other. So I'm hoping that not just myself, but those that eventually watch this video can see the problems and the insight that you've just given there. I don't know if this is necessarily a good question to ask, because as a respected journalist, you always want to report on what's true. But have you ever taken a big risk on a story or a rumor before, just out of curiosity?
Not really. I mean, definitely not as regards rumor. That's not what journalists do. There are rumors out there. Some of them are put out by agents. Some of them are totally unsubstantiated. Some of them are pushed by the buyer and some the seller. But I think that you have two options, really. One is that you go with something that you are given. And if you trust the source, then you may know that that is like a one-sided perspective. And usually I make that clear. Or the other thing is you always back it up by putting the story, whether you've got it or whether you've got wind of it through another journalist or source, to multiple sides. And in that multiple sides, you will get perspective and balance. And fans reading might say, well, you're sitting on the fence. But the reality is that 99% of the transfer window is a race that can change, that can be hijacked. Virtually nothing is clear cut until the final, I would say, week of a deal. And even with Gabriel Jesus, what was very interesting is that most Arsenal fans thought that that was a done deal and that Tottenham had either backed off or realised that they couldn't sell a focal point to Jesus and the team, which is why he preferred Arsenal. And that was absolutely true. But then Chelsea came with a late bid. And you never know until it's signed as the buyer, because fundamentally any club at any point could see how advanced you are, could get wind of the fee and could try their luck. And that's what Chelsea did with Gabriel Jesus. It didn't go anywhere. So as a journalist, you can take two approaches towards the transfer window. You can do the blow by blow or the live, and then what you say at the time of a recording or an article will be correct. But in a day or 2 days, it could change because players change their mind, because
of course
prospective buyers go cold, because clubs come and hijack bids. And the journalist giving you that blow by blow approach is not wrong at any point. It's simply the fact that things change. And Lisandro Martinez is another good example of that Manchester United hadn't done anything. Arsenal were preparing a third bid. A week later, Manchester United came in. It became a straight race. And then Martinez really liked the pitch from Arteta, but then Ten Hag ramped up the intensity. And then fundamentally, Manchester United were prepared to bid more than Arsenal, and they knew they had the player buy-in. So then Arsenal backed off. And that retrospectively is the narrative. Now, if you're following that day on day, none of those points as a journalist is incorrect to report at all.
No.
But obviously someone will retweet something that they've seen on Twitter that's a week old and say you were wrong. And it's not right or wrong. It's just a fluid, moving narrative. So if you provide the insight, like I always try to do, you have to give both sides. And Jules to Chelsea is another good example where you report the Chelsea confidence, but until it is signed, Barcelona could make a move. At this point, it's unlikely, but throughout the process, it hasn't been, because they've always been circling and wandering. And I think that there's another approach to the window where you write less, where you broadcast less. Often a broadcaster can't do that because you have live hits, but fundamentally you can do less and you can wait for the deal to be 90, 95, 99%. And then retrospectively, you can say what's happened. And it means that you're covering less transfers, but perhaps with more certainty. And I think that fans want that day to day, and they get frustrated by the changes. But that's the reality of the window.
Yeah.
Not necessarily journalists trying to push you for clicks. That's not trying to scaremonger about possibility A and possibility B. It's just the reality that you either want the insight or you don't. You want the day by day or you don't. And then coming back to your question, we never engage in rumor. You stand up something with a source, and the sources are credible enough and close enough to deals, either through the player or the agent or the sporting director or an executive at the club. You go to buyer, you go to seller, and then you get a clear sense of, is this legit? And then at that point, you report. And legit might be interest, it might be monitoring, it might be actually made an inquiry, it might be verbal conversations, it may be on the back burner, it may be on a short list, it may be starting to become advanced, it may be advanced, it may be an offer. And these are the different wordings that you hear. And again, fans get frustrated because they say, oh, Arsenal admire lots of players, Arsenal are interested in lots of players. But again, that's the reality. It's like if you are recruiting for a job, you're going to draw up a shortlist, and that shortlist is going to have 8 or 9. And then once you've narrowed it down to 2 and you have a preference, you may wait, because that preference may not have intimated if they're prepared to join. And then you're not going to dismiss your secondary candidate who could also do the job. You're going to wait to hear from your primary candidate if they do or don't want to join. And then with the secondary candidate, they're going to be left hanging. So this is the sort of finesse that you find with the window. And then I suppose to answer your question just briefly, more specifically, the only story I've been a little bit worried about, I suppose, was the Super League, really, because I'm perfectly fine with something out there and it not materializing, because I'm confident that I was correct in my information at the time of reporting. If it does or doesn't happen, that's out of my control. But as long as I'm accurate at the time, and usually I'll then give the next step and the next step. And then if you put them all together, you see the full picture of what's happened, which I think was very clear in my sense with, say, Raphinha to Barcelona eventually via interest from Chelsea and both Arsenal. But the Super League was interesting because I was told very categorically by Atletico Madrid and by Chelsea in particular that they did not be part of the Super League. And I reported that very clearly and fervently for weeks. Then, days before the press releases came out for the Super League, I was also told that they were reticent about joining the Super League and they didn't think that it was going to get off the ground. So I reported that. And then suddenly these midnight press releases came out with all the clubs saying that they were joining. And you're like, hang on a minute, I'm worried now. I've very recently gone to very senior sources and they've all said the same thing, that they are reticent and they do not think the project is going to happen. And out come all these collective press releases and you're like, yikes. But you have to back yourself. Then I went back to Atleti and I went back to Chelsea and I said, are you actually going to join, or is this almost a contractual obligation with a view to testing the water? And Chelsea intimated that it was very much a collective approach by the clubs and a pre-agreed wording. And Atleti still said that they really didn't want to join. And then, of course, 48 hours later, there were protests. And then I reported that Atleti would be pulling out and that Chelsea would be pulling out. And that was the same, basically, viewpoint as before the press releases came out. And then as it happened, within another 24 hours, both those clubs pulled out. And I was the first to report that Atleti were going to pull out and one of the first to report that Chelsea were going to pull out. So then you've got confidence, because what that tells you is the sources that had originally intimated they were not keen hadn't misled you. It wasn't just a narrative. It wasn't just a PR. So that's when you then go back to those sources as a journalist, you feel like when they choose to tell you something, you can fully trust them. It's not just gamesmanship, because there's proof historically that what they've told you is reliable. And that helps build your own confidence as a journalist in terms of when you report and what you may report, because you've not been let down by that source.
Of course. And you know what? I'm glad that you've gone through that, because as I mentioned off the back of the previous question, a lot of us fans don't appreciate enough, I think, what you guys as journalists have to go through and the amount of hard work that you put in. And at times, you're putting your reputation on the line with some of these stories that you're reporting. So I'm really, really glad that you've gone through that. And I'm hoping, as I said, that anyone watching can now appreciate the work that you guys do a little bit more. And I am conscious of time. So we are going to jump into the transfer section of today's interview. And what I wanted to kick off with is Zinchenko. It's no secret now that he's, hours or days away from being officially announced as an Arsenal player. But from my point of view, what I'm most curious about is that Arsenal have a need to find someone at left back and central midfield. Where does he fit in to Arsenal's plans, and how might that affect where Arsenal sign their next player? Because it's no secret that Arsenal are interested in various central midfielders as well.
Yeah, the beauty of Zinchenko to Arteta is in that versatility, as you've just neatly outlined, and he can play inverted left back, or in the left side of a midfield. And
Yes.
Arsenal are still looking at other players that can also slot into that midfield area, not specifically the left midfield. Obviously, with Tielemans, he's a box-to-box central midfielder, attacking midfielder, and so on. And with Paqueta, he's a kind of number 10, but what's worth noting with Paqueta is that his favoured position, even if he doesn't always play there, as he has said on record, is the left side of midfield. So I think will be utilised in a variety of different ways. I don't think that Arteta has nailed one set position, because there's competition at left back and there is a need to strengthen the midfield. So if he's to play week in, week out, then he may be utilised in a variety of different ways. But the big selling point to Zinchenko is the fact that, unlike at Manchester City, he'll have a regular sense of game time and a defined role. And for Ukraine, he really enjoys playing in midfield and he's excelled in that role. So it wouldn't remotely surprise me if he does see some midfield time at Arsenal. But that strengthening of the left-back position is also vital as well from Mikel Arteta's perspective. So the appeal, as I say, in the signing is not rigidly forcing him in one position. It's the fact that he can very comfortably do both. So then Arteta gets a 2-for-1 signing for a relatively bargain fee, in my opinion, anyway. And make no mistake, Manchester City didn't desperately want to let him go. Very well liked on and off the football field at that club. And at CBS, we did an interview with Rodri recently, and he made it clear that Zinchenko was somebody that he was particularly sad to see go. And the reason for that is because he's a big influence in the dressing room. He's an extremely hard worker. He's versatile. He's very positive in how he passes the ball. He's a good decision maker. And he slots into a lot of different systems. And I think that fans sometimes look at a system or a starting 11, but managers look at game management as well.
Right.
It's not just about how you start a game. It's about who can I utilize when we're one up or one down, or when we need to protect a lead, or when there's 15 minutes to go, whether as a starting player or off the bench. Who can we use to get a fast start and dominate a game, or make sure that we've got more of the ball? Who can we use to make sure we don't get caught on the counter-attack? Right. So it's not just about what is the preferred formation of a football manager. It's also about how individual players slot into moments within a game, not just the full 90 minutes. And I think because we all view our team on paper when a sheet comes out and we say, well, we're better than this team, we're going to win this game, we'll play this formation, if we make a fast start, we'll win. Everyone looks at it very much collectively across the 90 minutes, but that's not what managers do. They break down permutations and possibilities, and they look at what might happen in a game, and then in training they run scenarios and they say, okay, this is our set piece scenario, this is our game management scenario, this is our defensive scenario, here's what we want to do if we're 2-0 up in the game, here's what we want to do if we're 2-0 down at the game. And that allows more finesse. And a player like Zinchenko is relevant in that context because he can move between positions, he can move between formations, he's very cool on the ball, he's very direct. So he plays into a lot of Arteta's different systems, whether that is across 90 minutes or in a game management sense. And that, I think, is specifically why Arteta thinks he'll be a fantastic signing, because he's a fit to the football club. And the same can be said for Gabriel Jesus.
Two players I'm very excited to see next season in an Arsenal shirt. And you mentioned midfield briefly. You mentioned Tielemans, Paqueta. Another name that's sort of popped up in the last few days is Artur, again, off the back of our interest in January. Any updates across those three players or other names in general in midfield that we're not quite aware of as of yet?
As you say, the Artur links are long-standing. There's nothing particularly advanced at this stage, but certainly a name on Arsenal's shortlist. I think the challenge is just Arsenal have got history there, and they know how difficult the negotiation may prove. But it's one to watch during the window. I don't think a priority at this stage, but it could move over the coming weeks. Tielemans is the intriguing one because Arsenal have never walked away, and it is very clear that the player wants to join Arsenal. And really, there's things that will happen. Either Arsenal will move and they'll get the player, or they'll be forced to move because another club comes in, or alternatively, we'll see another target in that midfield area supplant Tielemans. And if they bring in one more midfielder of any sorts, then I think Tielemans to Arsenal will be over, and it will be as simple as that. But Arsenal know they can get Tielemans, and that's the main point. So it's not a case of hitches with Leicester because they've never actually got to the point of placing an official bid, and the lowest fee will be about 25 million, the highest fee will be 31, 32 million. So there's not a huge discrepancy financially, so it's not going to be too tricky to get a deal done with Leicester. But for whatever reason, Arsenal haven't moved. They've prioritized other targets. I think in January it was clear that Tielemans was an absolute priority, and both Arsenal and Tielemans were sold on getting that deal done in the summer. But Zinchenko's come in now, who can play in midfield, and all of the time and energy got put prior to that on getting Gabriel Jesus over the line. So now what you find is that once 2 or 3 come in, and Arsenal have had a great window so far, managers take a breath, and they do that because there's no logic in getting everybody in by day one of the season, even if fans perhaps think that that's the most prudent approach. The far better thing to do is get in your core few targets, and then you look in pre-season and even a few regular games of the season, and you say, okay, how's the chemistry working? Now who do we need? And then you can look in practice at how your new signings have fitted in and how existing players have either improved or developed based upon the new dynamic of the squad. And then at that point you say, now who do we want to revisit? If everything is rubbish early in the window, you can actually overbuy and please your fan base, but then find that maybe you've made a wrong decision, or maybe you wanted to wait and see. And the final point on, say, Tielemans is just leverage. That the longer it goes on in the window, the more leverage Arsenal will have, because Leicester know that he doesn't want to sign a new deal to get the best possible deal. So you can delay and you can delay if you've got the player buy-in, because you don't have a feasible deal. But it may be that Arsenal choose the opposite approach. And if they go for one of the other midfield targets, then at that point, you might find that a Manchester United or a Newcastle United enter the race for him as well. So that's one to watch. And I suppose the last thing on Tielemans that's just worth flagging is the fact that the midfield is now pretty deep. There could have to be an outgoing first. And then with Paqueta, there's an interest, but there's no offer. So there's nothing advanced there. And everyone's getting excited about Paqueta, but unfortunately the reports that Lyon will let him leave for a cut price are incorrect, and it is still to be a 65 odd million euros deal. And the other challenge is that there's a power dynamic within Lyon between both the club hierarchy and Paqueta, but also within the club hierarchy. So Paqueta wants a fresh challenge. That's where the hope allows a club like Arsenal to at least inquire. And what they've done is they've gone to the agent of the player to see if there's buy-in, and that's about as far as it's got. And Arteta admires Paqueta. There's no denying that, and so does Edu, which is why it could during the window. But there's nothing beyond that. And Arsenal are definitely reticent about what would be a tough negotiation with Lyon, to the tune, as I say, of 65 million odd euros. So I'm not entirely sure what the English maths is off the top of my head, but 52, 53 million quid. It's not a 35 million deal, as some have reported. It's at least 10 or 15 million more than that due to the level of it. But the power dynamic between Lyon's own hierarchy is down to the fact that Jean-Michel Aulas is a tough negotiator. He says that he's got lots of offers. None of those formal offers have come to Lyon from Arsenal or Newcastle United at this point. But you also have a new incoming majority shareholder at Lyon by the name of John Textor, who is an American. And he's in yet, but he is going to have the whole say when he finally gets in. And he's already said on record that he wants Lyon to challenge PSG. So Textor doesn't really want Paqueta to go. So the key question is Jean-Michel Aulas flexing because he wants the sale and he feels like the player wants out, is Jean-Michel Aulas working with Textor and almost being scapegoated? So then when Textor comes in, he can say, well, that sale of Paqueta was all done before my time. Or actually, is Jean-Michel Aulas just talking about a sale now because he can? And then when Textor comes in, Lyon will U-turn on their position and try and force the player to sell. And we honestly don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
There is politics within Lyon's hierarchy about whether it's even prudent to sell Paqueta or it's unambitious based upon Textor's long-term strategy. And because he's not in yet and doesn't actually have any formal say, that could also make the transfer of Paqueta drag on a little bit. So the simple answer is that Arsenal's interest is real. Nothing is advanced, but whatever happens and whoever gets Paqueta, it's going to be a bit of a bidding war. And it's also going to be a very complicated negotiation with Lyon.
It certainly sounds like a very complicated, but like you say, interesting situation to keep an eye on. And one other area that Arsenal are looking to strengthen in, having lost out on Raphinha, is the sort of right wing / right forward position, which has gone quiet from what I understand. I could be wrong, but are you able to sort of shed any light on whether or not Arsenal are pursuing any targets in that area at the moment?
Yeah, there's nothing major at this point. And I know the fan base are getting relatively excited about so-called mystery wingers and so on. But the reality of the situation is that Arsenal and Edu tend to work relatively secretly, and they may well have options as per Vieira that I'll openly admit I didn't know about until very late in the deal. And I'm sure that other journalists will agree that that was the case.
Absolutely.
With somebody like a Gabriel Jesus or a Zinchenko, it's actually easier for a journalist working across Premier League clubs because a number of us have got strong Manchester City contacts. So it's harder for Arsenal to keep secret. But with Vieira, they pretty much pulled a rabbit out of a hat there. And it was a fast deal. And we learned about it relatively late in the process. So, of course, it's possible that there is some mystery target. It won't be Diaby. He said on record that he's going to stay at Bayer Leverkusen. I know that there's huge excitement about the Leroy Sane links, if you like.
Yes.
I'm one of them quoted. But to give you the full context, and if people go back and listen to what was said and read the full quotes, the Sane interest came before Raphinha. And that's really important because it tells you that he is a name on a list in that position. And it also shows you that Arsenal are exploring that particular position. So they could revisit it again during the window. But the reality of the situation is that Sane is very difficult to get. There has been interest from Real Madrid, but Bayern Munich's stance continues to be that they would like ideally to keep the player. So it remains to be seen whether anybody can prize him away. I think that's the first thing to point out. And then with Sane, there would also be a price issue as well. And I think Bayern's position, as I understand it, which is possibly why Arsenal tried for Raphinha, is that they do not want to sell him. And if they are to even consider offers, then it would be above what they paid for him, which was around 55 million from Manchester City. So you're suddenly looking at a large transfer fee and a club that ideally doesn't want to stay. And Bayern are ready to try and get Sane to at least do another year, if at all possible. So, of course, if the player has buy-in from a particular suitor, that can change the dynamic. But at the moment, Arsenal's interest in Sane was as a player on a shortlist that they were interested in, but they moved for Raphinha instead. And I think that says a lot. And then if the dynamic changes later in the window with Sane, which I suppose is still possible, but again, to reiterate, Bayern's position is they would like to keep the player, then you're going to get a high level of interest because that's when Real will revisit, and that's when potentially other Premier League clubs could also join the race as well. So I think that it's a complicated negotiation. It's not impossible, but the original interest in Sane is historical rather than active as of the time of recording.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Definitely one to keep an eye on. As you said, you know, there's not too many names floating around. And I've got two transfer questions left for you, and then I want to finish up on a prediction, as I am very, very conscious of time. Another one that Arsenal fans will be keen to learn more about is there are various potential contract renewals with the likes of Martinelli, Saka, Gabriel, to name just but a few. Any updates that you can provide on some of those names?
Yeah, turning attentions to two in particular, Saliba and Saka. Saliba, I think, really enjoyed his time at Marseille, but they've had a managerial change. And although they've tried to come back in for the player, Mikel Arteta has been very clear with Saliba that he wants to keep him at the football club. So a lot is about convincing Saliba of his long-term future. There's still a chance as the window starts to close that Marseille try and make another swoop for the player. But from Arsenal's perspective, they want to keep him at the football club. And he feels that he did well enough at Marseille to be a big part of this season. So it's about Mikel Arteta convincing him of his role in the team and where he fits comparative to other players and partnerships. And then with Saka, I believe at this stage, speaking to sources at Arsenal, that he's untouchable. I know there's interest from Manchester City. And again, another very stood by a window is that clubs are always approaching other clubs about players with a view to this window or imminent transfers. And in the same way that Arsenal fans now know that discussions with Tielemans in January were with a view to the summer, it's very normal for a club like Manchester City to be exploring long-term futures of players like Saka in the same way that Chelsea have inquired, as of many other clubs, about Declan Rice, but they know they're not going to get him in this window. And then what that does when it's out there is it gets fan bases excited or panicked, depending on if it's their player or a player they might buy, because they're like, yikes, somebody's going to make an offer. But the Saka plan for clubs like Manchester City is long-term, because they know that Arsenal are looking to keep Saka in the short term and will in all likelihood reject any offers, barring something astronomical and barring the player handing in a transfer request, both of which I think are highly, highly unlikely. So with Saka, Arsenal are hoping to get him to sign a new contract, and they're very confident of that. And again, the reason why you do that is because you get a double win. You get a commitment from the player, but you also get him on longer terms, which means that in the future, as clubs see whether in a year or 2 years he might be available, the fact you've got him to sign means that you're protecting your transfer fee and you're protecting the player's future over the course of the more imminent future. And this is just normal practice for any club. And this, again, is Leicester would ideally like Youri Tielemans to sign. It doesn't mean that transfer this window in January next summer, if he was to re-sign, is off the table. It just means that suddenly Leicester can say, well, now he's re-signed, we've bought time and we've also got a higher transfer fee because there's a longer tenure on his contract. And I think that that is just part of sensible negotiating between a club and a player. And it may be not specific to Saka, by the way, now that with certain players, they do agree to sign a short-term contract, and then in return, they're told they will be allowed to leave in January or the summer. And then, as I say, the selling club gets a higher fee. The player knows that they will be allowed to leave, but they give the club they're at a little bit more time. But in Saka's case, it simply is the fact that Arsenal do not want to sell and expect him to sign a new contract. And they've got every confidence that will happen relatively imminently. And then other outgoings, I can't claim to be an expert on every single name, big or small at Arsenal, but Leno wants to leave. He disappointed with the fact that Arsenal haven't lowered the transfer fee, with Fulham being interested. Pepe is obviously the interesting and demoralizing one, because whoever comes in for a bid is sort of going to get a bargain, financially speaking. Arsenal are definitely going to make money off that deal. Sevilla are interested. Newcastle are very vaguely circling, but there's nothing advanced at this point, but they may make a decision as and when other bids come in. But with Sevilla, the thing to watch is really that if Jules Koundé goes to Chelsea, and the reality is Jules Koundé is going somewhere, so they're going to get money regardless, but Chelsea is highly, highly likely with a deal imminent, then they're going to get a record transfer fee and they may be able to move on a player like Pepe. So that's one to watch, but he's surplus to requirements. Maitland-Niles is an interesting one. He's come through the academy and it'd be great if he could make a success of Arsenal, but I think there'll be offers. I know historically Nottingham Forest are one of the clubs that have made inquiries. So that's watch as well. But there will be outgoings, and naturally, if a Tielemans or a midfielder comes in, there'll probably have to be some kind of midfield outgoing as well in order to bring in more names. So it's a balance, and Arsenal might look to a few outgoings now before they finalise their next incoming. But the reality is that the incomings and the outgoings at the Emirates Stadium have been very active and will continue to be so right up until the window closes. And that's why I think it's going to be such a good window for Arsenal, because they've already brought in quality, and I still think there's more to come. And then once they alleviate some players on the wage bill and get rid of the Pepe problem, Bellerin as well, by the way, would love to move to Real Betis, so that move could still happen as well. And then you get a scenario where the clear out complements the incomings, and the squad balance, the squad numbers, the squad wage bill is all kind of leveled off. And that's why outgoings are just as important really as incomings in many senses. So I think Arsenal are on course for a really good window and can be very excited by the season ahead.
Well, no, I really appreciate the update on outgoings as well. It was a question I was going to ask, so you beat me to it. And just to finish up, literally the last, very, very last question. And I appreciate, this opinion could change depending on incomings and outgoings at various clubs. But as things stand, who sort of meets your top 6 for next season?
Yeah, I think the top 2 is obvious, Man City and Liverpool still. I don't see anybody closing the gulf on them. Unfortunately, from Arsenal's perspective, it would be a big last season to be challenging for the Premier League. And you look at who City have brought in, and even the fact that they're prepared to let Zinchenko and Jesus and Sterling go, that shows you how confident they are in their incomings and the kind of quality they've brought in through players like Calvin Phillips and Alvarez, and obviously Erling Haaland as well. And Grealish, I think, is going to grow from strength to strength and have a standout season as well. So for me, it's City 1 and Liverpool 2. Nunez has done well in pre-season so far. I think he scored 4 goals the other day from memory, but the reality is that he may take a little bit more time to settle. But Liverpool have the advantage that Salah has stayed at the football club and will still weigh in with a ton of goals to make them right up there as well. I don't see either of those teams losing more than 2 or 3 games across the whole season. And the Premier League probably once again come down to how they fare when they're head-to-head. And then I think Chelsea are going to have a good window by the end of it. Sterling's an excellent signing. Koulibaly, if they get Koundé as well, they may then turn their attention to either another attacker or a midfielder. So unfortunately, from Arsenal's perspective, even with Gabriel Jesus's goals, I'm sure he'll score. I think Chelsea are my 3, and then I'm going to put Arsenal 4 only because I'm on an Arsenal podcast. But I do that Tottenham have had a very impressive window. But I suppose the way that I see it is that Arsenal, for much of last season, especially up until January and even until mid-March, were in a really strong position. So there was a lot to like last season. And then from March onwards, they just blew it. And we all know about the North London derby and the loss away at Newcastle, and then Spurs leapfrogged them. But there was a lot of potential. And even though it's a very simplistic view, if you took Jesus's, let's just say, 15 goals that he might score and put them into the Arsenal team last season, Arsenal would have finished above Spurs. So I think Jesus alone, if Arsenal replicate much of last season, even though they were patchy at times and had both win streaks and lose streaks, I think there was only 1 draw in 2022. So they were either winning games for fun or falling to pieces and losing disappointing games with not much in between. And I think that if the game management and the consistency in Jesus's goals comes in, even if that's all they have, and Zinchenko doesn't make an impact, and Marquinhos is perhaps too young, and Turner's a backup goalkeeper, and so on. So even just with Jesus alone, I think that puts Arsenal 4th for me, and anything else will narrow the gap between Arsenal and Chelsea. Then I think you have Spurs. Then I think potentially, just to be a bit contentious but slightly tongue-in-cheek, so I told you at the beginning I've got a soft spot for them, you maybe have Newcastle, with West Ham and Manchester United being the teams that don't move or improve, and Manchester United are obviously struggling in this window. So Newcastle's the one I'm intrigued by because they finished the back end of last season on European form. So if they continue that, I can see them being 6th. Spurs and Arsenal are going to be very close. And then obviously I think Chelsea and then Man City and Liverpool are still just streaks ahead, and I don't see that changing. So it's Man City for the Premier League for me. It's Arsenal for the top four, but largely just because I'm on an Arsenal podcast and I know my audience, but it's going to be very, very tight against Spurs.
Well, look, I would absolutely take that. Absolutely take that. I completely agree with the top two. So
the last thing I was just going to add is key week in a gauge of Arsenal's season is the first week in October, where Arsenal are home to Tottenham and then home to Liverpool. And those two games are momentum builders, and they're going to give us a read on where Arsenal are coming into that game, where they are after that game. It's too soon to be saying after those two games that indicates something will happen, but what it will show us that early in the season is where the momentum is taking Arsenal. And because they're back-to-back games, both against big teams, both against rivals, I think that's the first point when we should judge the direction that Arsenal are heading. So I'm really intrigued to see how they fare. And they're both at home as well. So it's really important that Arteta gets results against the big sides around Arsenal if they are to qualify for Champions League football.
Brilliant. No, absolutely. Very, very good point made. And as I said, happy with your prediction. I'll take that at the end of the season. And I think that's going to about wrap things up for today. I've kept you a little longer than promised, so I really do appreciate your time. Very, very, very grateful. Unless you've got anything else to add, then we'll wrap things up for today, I suppose.
Yeah, no, always a pleasure talking to Arsenal fans. And let's hope that Arsenal continue to have a good pre-season and a good transfer window as well. As I said already, there'll be a few more to come in. And stay tuned as well to our CBS output. We cover a lot of Arsenal. It may be a little bit late by the time this goes out, but today and at the time of recording, we are at 12:30 UK on a Friday, at 2 o'clock UK on a Friday, but it's available retrospectively on YouTube. We've got CBS Live with Fabrizio specifically on Arsenal. So keep across that. And then social media wise, CBS Sports Golazo, CBS with an S, Sports with an S, and Golazo, Golazo. CBS Sports Golazo is our handle, and you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. And then if you happen to be listening to this and are across North America, we've got CBS Sports HQ as well, which is like our equivalent of Sky Sports News. And that's where you'll see our rolling broadcast coverage, where we give you all the latest transfer news. So do give us a follow. We do a lot of Arsenal stuff. And it's just great to engage with the fan base. Never be afraid to reach out if you've got any questions. Always try and answer as openly and honestly as I can. And good luck to Arsenal for the season ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Ben. And make sure for anyone who is watching to go and follow him and all of the channels that he's just mentioned. But for now, that's going to about wrap things up. Thank you very much for your time, Ben. And goodbye, Gooners.